Did anyone even invite her? Daniel Whitmore didn't lower his voice when he said it, and the words slid across the polished mahogany table like something sharp enough to cut, drawing a few tight smiles from the executives seated beneath the cold white lights as Ava Brooks stood near the glass wall at the far end of the room, her reflection faint and fractured in the city skyline behind her, 32 floors above the street, where people moved like distant shadows, unseen, unheard, exactly how she was supposed to be in a room like this, silent, temporary, forgettable, a contractor with a badge that didn't quite belong, fingers wrapped around a slim tablet she hadn't planned to use. Not here. Not today. Not in front of a man whose decisions moved numbers with more zeros than she'd seen in her entire life. But the numbers on the screen didn't sit right. They hadn't the second she glanced at them. Projections climbing too clean, too perfect, like a story written to be believed instead of checked. And as Daniel turned back to the presentation without waiting for an answer, dismissing her presence with nothing more than a glance that never quite landed, the room followed his lead, eyes shifting forward, pens tapping lightly, someone adjusting a cufflink, someone else scrolling through notes, the quiet choreography of people who knew exactly where power sat and how not to disturb it. While Ava remained still for a beat too long, her heartbeat loud in her ears, the hum of the overhead lights pressing down, the faint scent of coffee and expensive cologne lingering in the air, and she told herself to stay quiet, to let it pass, to finish the hour and leave with her paycheck intact, because that's what people like her did in rooms like this. They observed, they disappeared, they didn't interrupt, they didn't risk, they didn't step forward, but then the slide changed again and the numbers repeated, the same flaw buried deeper, dressed in different language, and something in her chest tightened. Not fear exactly, but recognition, the kind that doesn't let go once it takes hold. And before she could talk herself out of it, before the moment sealed shut, Ava pushed off the wall and took one step forward, the sound of her heel against the marble floor small, but sharp enough to draw a few glances, her voice steady in a way she didn't feel as it cut through the air, just enough to stop the rhythm of the room. That projection is wrong, she said, not loud, not aggressive, just clear, and for the first time since she walked in, every head turned, including Daniel's, his expression tightening not with anger, but with something colder, something measured, as if recalculating the space she had just stepped into. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, waiting, stretching, as Ava stood there with the city behind her and the weight of every eye in front of her, knowing she had just crossed a line that didn't belong to her, and there was no stepping back from it now. No one spoke for a full second, and in a room where seconds usually moved fast and clean, this one stretched, heavy and uncertain, as Ava Brooks felt the weight of her own words settle into the air around her, the tablet still warm in her hand, her pulse steadying not because she was calm, but because there was no way back now. And across the table Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, not reacting the way most men would, not raising his voice, not dismissing her outright, but studying her with a quiet precision that felt colder than anger, as if he were trying to place her, to understand how someone who did not belong had managed to interrupt something so carefully controlled. And when he finally spoke, his tone was even, measured, almost polite in a way that carried more weight than a shout ever could. Explain, he said, just one word, and it shifted the room again. Because now this was not a disruption, this was a test, and Ava stepped forward another inch, just enough to place herself fully inside the conversation instead of at its edge, her reflection disappearing from the glass behind her as she focused on the screen displaying the projections, the numbers clean and rising in a pattern that would have impressed anyone who did not look twice. The growth rate assumes a fixed supply chain cost, she said, her voice finding a rhythm now, grounded in something familiar, something she trusted more than the room. But your partner adjusted the variable here. She pointed, not touching the screen but indicating the line with certainty. And here, another pause, another breath. They buried the increase in a separate column that does not trigger the model's risk threshold. A few heads tilted, a few eyes narrowed. The quiet sound of someone tapping a keyboard breaking the silence as one of the analysts pulled the document closer, and Ava did not rush. She did not fill the silence with more than what was necessary, because she knew the numbers would speak if given the chance. And Daniel's gaze did not leave her, his fingers resting lightly against the table, still, controlled, as if the entire room were waiting for him to decide whether this moment mattered or not. And somewhere near the center of the table, a man in a navy suit leaned forward, scrolling, his brow tightening as he moved through the columns Ava had pointed out, the faint glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. And then he stopped, just for a second, his hand hovering, and the shift was small but undeniable, like a crack forming beneath something that had looked solid moments ago. And Ava felt it before anyone said a word, that subtle change in energy, that hesitation, and she held her ground, not pushing, not retreating, just standing there with the quiet certainty of someone who knew what she had seen. While outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city continued moving, cars threading through streets far below, unaware that inside this room something had just begun to unravel. And Daniel Whitmore's eyes flicked, not to the screen, but back to her, sharper now, more focused, as if the outline of who she was had just come into view for the first time. And the silence returned, thicker than before, no longer dismissive, but listening. The analyst in the navy suit did not speak right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make everyone else uneasy as his fingers moved again, slower now, scrolling back, then forward, then stopping on the exact line Ava had pointed out. And this time he leaned closer, the confidence in his posture shifting into something tighter, more careful, while another executive beside him pulled the same file onto his tablet, glancing between columns as if searching for a mistake that should not be there. And across the table a quiet murmur began, not loud enough to break the room, but enough to ripple through it, a subtle fracture in what had been certainty just moments ago. And Ava remained still, her hands steady at her sides, resisting the urge to explain further because she knew the moment had moved beyond her voice now. It belonged to the numbers, and Daniel Whitmore finally shifted his attention to the screen, not quickly, not reactively, but with a deliberate calm that suggested control even as the room around him began to lose it, his eyes scanning the projections with a precision that matched the reputation that had built his name. And when he reached the section Ava had indicated, his expression did not change immediately, but something in his posture did, a slight tightening in his shoulders, a pause that lasted a fraction longer than before. And that was enough, because everyone in that room was trained to read moments like that, to recognize when something had gone off script. And the man presenting at the front cleared his throat softly, adjusting his tie as if that might steady the situation. The model accounts for, he began, but his voice lost its edge halfway through the sentence, fading under the growing tension as the second analyst spoke up, quieter but sharper. It does not, he said, eyes still locked on the screen. The threshold is bypassed. And now the room fully shifted, chairs creaking slightly as people leaned in, screens lighting up with recalculations, the soft tapping of keys replacing the earlier stillness. And Ava felt the weight of attention turn, not dismissive anymore, not skeptical, but searching, measuring, as if everyone was recalibrating not just the numbers, but her place in the room. And Daniel did not interrupt, did not raise his voice. He simply watched, absorbing the unfolding realization with a focus that made the air feel thinner. And when the analyst finally looked up, there was no hesitation left in his expression, only a quiet certainty that echoed Ava's own. If this goes through, he said, choosing his words carefully, the liability exposure is significantly higher than reported. And the words landed heavier than any accusation, because they were not dramatic, they were factual, and facts in a room like this carried weight that could not be ignored. And Daniel's gaze moved back to Ava, slower this time, more deliberate, as if seeing not just the interruption but the consequence of it, the disruption of something much larger than a presentation. And for the first time since she spoke, the room was no longer deciding whether she belonged there. It was realizing what might have happened if she had stayed silent. The room did not return to normal, not after that, because once doubt entered a space built on certainty, it did not leave quietly. It spread, slow and deliberate. And Daniel Whitmore finally leaned forward, his hand resting flat against the table, the subtle shift enough to bring every side conversation to a stop without him saying a word. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but no longer dismissive. "Walk me through it," he said, not to the analysts, not to the presenter, but to Ava. And that alone changed everything. because moments earlier she had been invisible, and now the most powerful voice in the room had redirected the entire meeting toward her, and Ava felt it. The shift in gravity, the weight of expectation pressing in from every side. But she did not hesitate. Not now. Not after crossing that line. She stepped closer to the table, close enough to see the fine details in the printed documents, the subtle differences in formatting that most people would overlook, and she placed her tablet down gently, not as a shield, but as a reference. They separated the risk exposure across multiple reporting layers, she said, her tone steady, grounded in clarity rather than urgency. So it never triggers a single red flag, but when you consolidate it. She paused just long enough to let the idea settle. The total liability exceeds your projected margin by a significant amount. A few heads lifted at that, the phrase landing heavier than before, because now it was not a possibility. It was a calculation, and one of the analysts quickly mirrored her steps, pulling the data together, merging columns, recalculating in real time as the quiet tapping filled the room again. Faster now, sharper, and Ava did not speak over it. She let the process unfold, her eyes moving between the screens and the documents, tracking the same patterns she had seen minutes earlier. And across from her, Daniel watched. Not just the numbers, but her. The way she carried the explanation, the way she did not rush or overreach, the way her confidence came from understanding rather than performance. And that observation lingered longer than the data itself, because it was not something that could be calculated. And when the analyst finally stopped typing, his shoulders stiffened, and he looked up slowly, as if confirming the result would not change if he waited another second. She is right, he said, the words quiet but absolute, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but definitive, like a door closing somewhere deep inside the structure of the deal. And the presenter shifted uncomfortably, adjusting papers that no longer held the same weight, while others exchanged brief glances that said more than any discussion could. And Daniel's gaze did not move from Ava, not now, not after hearing those words. And for the first time there was no trace of dismissal left in his expression, only recognition, sharp and unmistakable, as if the outline of her presence had solidified into something undeniable. And the room, once so certain of its hierarchy, now held a quiet tension that did not ask who she was, but what she had just prevented from happening. No one moved to end the meeting, but it no longer felt like a meeting. It felt like something exposed, something unfinished hanging in the air, and the presenter at the front attempted to regain control, clearing his throat, straightening the edge of his documents as if precision could restore what had already slipped. There may be a misunderstanding in how the variables are being interpreted, he said carefully, choosing each word like it might steady the room, but his voice did not carry the same authority it had minutes ago, because now every assumption was under scrutiny, every number questioned, and Ava did not respond immediately. She did not interrupt. She simply watched as the explanation unfolded, recognizing the language, the structure, the subtle redirection meant to dilute what had already been confirmed. And Daniel did not look at the presenter when he spoke again, his attention still fixed on the table, on the recalculated figures glowing across multiple screens. Clarify the liability exposure, he said, his tone quieter now, but heavier. And this time it was not a request, it was a directive. And the analyst who had verified the data inhaled slowly before answering. If we proceed under the current structure, the downstream exposure could exceed projections by several $1 million within the first fiscal cycle. The words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not speculative, not theoretical, but immediate, measurable. And the silence that followed was not confusion. It was realization, the kind that comes too late to feel comfortable. And Ava felt the shift again, deeper this time, not just in how they saw the numbers, but in how they were beginning to see her, no longer as an interruption, but as the source of something they had missed. And yet she remained still, her posture unchanged, because she understood that recognition did not erase what came before it, it only followed it. And across the table, Daniel finally leaned back, his fingers tapping once, twice, against the polished surface, a quiet rhythm that seemed to organize his thoughts. And when he looked up, his gaze moved from the data to Ava with a focus that no longer questioned her presence, but measured her impact. How did you catch it? He asked, and the question was simple. But in a room like this, simplicity carried intent. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, not challenging, not defensive, just direct. "I have seen it before," she said, her voice even, grounded in memory rather than explanation. And that answer lingered longer than expected, because it suggested something beyond this room, beyond this deal, a history that had not been considered. And Daniel held that for a moment, as if weighing not just the answer but what it implied. While around them the executives sat quieter than before, the earlier confidence replaced by a careful attention that did not dare dismiss anything too quickly. And the meeting, once driven by momentum, now moved with caution, because the direction had changed, and everyone in the room knew it, even if no one said it out loud, that what had almost been signed minutes ago was no longer something they could trust, and that the voice they had nearly ignored had just altered the outcome in a way that could not be undone. The room did not rush forward after that. It slowed, like everything inside it had to recalibrate, and the energy that once pushed decisions quickly now held back, cautious, almost uncertain, while sunlight shifted slightly across the glass walls, casting a softer glow over the table where numbers still flickered on screens that no longer looked as certain as they had minutes ago. And Ava Brooks stood quietly beside the table, not at the center, not claiming space that had not been offered, but no longer pushed to the edge either. Her presence settled into the room in a different way now, not invisible, not questioned, just there, steady. And Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately. He let the silence hold, not as pressure, but as thought, his gaze drifting briefly toward the skyline beyond the windows, the city stretching out in clean lines and distant motion, a reminder of everything that depended on decisions made in rooms like this. And when he finally looked back, his expression had shifted again, not softened, but more precise, more aware, as if something had been adjusted internally, something small but significant. "Pause the deal," he said quietly, and no one challenged it. No one asked for clarification, because the tone left no room for debate, and the presenter lowered his documents without argument, the edges no longer sharp in his hands, while the analysts leaned back slightly, the urgency of their work replaced by a different kind of attention. One, settle fully. The weight of what had been avoided pressing into the quiet space between people, not dramatic, not loud, but real, and she allowed herself a single breath, slow and controlled, before reaching down to lift her tablet from the table, her fingers brushing the cool surface as she prepared to step back, to return to the role she had walked in with, because that was the pattern she knew: speak when necessary, then disappear. But before she could turn, Daniel's voice came again, not raised, not forceful, just clear. "Stay," he said, and the word landed differently than before, not dismissive, not questioning, but intentional. And Ava paused, just for a fraction of a second, her hand still resting lightly against the edge of the table, the reflection of the city catching faintly in the glass behind her again. And she did not move away this time, not fully, because something in the room had changed, something that could not be reversed by simply stepping back into silence. And around them the executives remained quiet, not out of discomfort now, but out of recognition, as if they understood that whatever came next would not follow the same script they had started with. And the room, once driven by authority alone, now held a different kind of balance, one shaped not by position, but by truth that had already been spoken and could not be unheard. The word stayed in the air longer than expected, not because it was loud, but because of who said it, and Ava Brooks felt it before she turned, that subtle shift where a single instruction carried weight beyond itself, and she stopped mid-motion, her fingers still resting against the edge of her tablet, her posture steady as she faced the table again, not stepping forward this time, not stepping back either, simply holding her ground as Daniel Whitmore leaned slightly forward, his attention no longer divided between data and authority but focused entirely on her. And the room followed without question, every executive now watching not out of curiosity but intent, because something had changed in a way that could not be ignored. And Daniel spoke again, slower this time, as if choosing each word with more care than before. "You said you have seen this before," he said, his tone even, not interrogating, but deliberate. "Where?" And the question did not feel like a challenge, it felt like an opening, and Ava did not rush to answer. She took a breath, the kind that grounded rather than filled, her eyes steady as she met his. 3 years ago, she said, her voice calm, measured. A similar structure passed through a mid-sized firm I worked with. The variables were hidden the same way, spread across separate reports, so no single model flagged the risk. A quiet stillness settled deeper into the room, not tense now, but focused, as if every word mattered more than the last. And Ava continued, not adding drama, not emphasizing beyond what was necessary. They signed it, she said simply. And within 18 months the losses forced them to restructure their entire operation. A few glances exchanged across the table, subtle but meaningful, the kind that carried understanding without needing explanation, and Daniel did not interrupt, his gaze fixed, absorbing not just the outcome but the certainty in how she delivered it. And for a brief moment his eyes shifted, not to the screen, not to the analysts, but to the space just beyond her, as if mapping the distance between what had almost happened and what had just been avoided. And when he spoke again his voice was quieter, but it carried a different kind of weight. And today, he said, we almost made the same mistake, and it was not a question, it was a realization, and no one in the room corrected him, no one softened it, because the truth did not need adjustment. It had already settled into place, and Ava did not respond with pride or relief. She simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more restraint than reaction, and that restraint lingered in the room, shaping the moment in a way that words could not, because it made clear that what she had done was not about proving something, it was about preventing something. And Daniel leaned back slowly, his hand resting against the table again, but this time the movement felt different, not controlling the room, but recalibrating it, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was understood, shared, as if everyone present had reached the same conclusion without needing to say it out loud, that the person they had nearly overlooked had just changed the outcome of something far larger than the meeting itself, and that realization, once formed, did not fade. It stayed, quiet and undeniable. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, gradually, as if the room itself had exhaled and was now settling into something new, something more honest. And Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the table before lifting again toward Ava Brooks, not with the detached precision from earlier, but with a clarity that acknowledged what had just taken place. And when he spoke, his voice carried less distance, less authority for its own sake. You should have been part of this review from the beginning, he said, and the statement landed differently than anything he had said before, not as a command, not as a correction, but as recognition. And Ava did not respond immediately, not because she did not hear it, but because she understood the weight of what was being said, and she held her posture steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, grounded in the same quiet confidence that had brought her to speak in the first place. While around them the executives remained attentive, no longer shifting in their seats, no longer checking their devices, because this moment had moved beyond numbers and into something less measurable, something that changed how people saw each other. And Daniel continued, his tone measured, careful. We rely on analysis to protect decisions like this, he said, glancing briefly at the screen still displaying recalculated figures. But analysis only works when someone is willing to question what looks correct. And his eyes returned to Ava, holding there, not briefly, not in passing, but deliberately. And for a second the room felt smaller, quieter, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away. And Ava finally spoke, her voice even, not elevated by the moment, not diminished by it either. I was just doing what the numbers showed, she said, and the simplicity of it lingered, because it did not match the scale of what had just been avoided. It reduced it to something straightforward, something grounded, and that contrast carried its own kind of weight. And Daniel gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but real, as if acknowledging not just her answer but the restraint within it. And he shifted his attention briefly to the rest of the table, the executives who had watched the entire exchange unfold. We are not moving forward with this deal as structured, he said, his lightly in her hand again, the same object she had carried into the room unnoticed, and now the only sound was the soft shuffle of papers, the faint hum of electronics powering down, and the distant city beyond the glass continuing its steady rhythm. unchanged by what had just unfolded inside, and Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a second longer than everyone else, his eyes following Ava as she moved toward the door, not with urgency, not with control, but with a kind of stillness that suggested reflection, as if he were replaying the moment when everything had shifted and measuring the distance between what he had almost overlooked and what had been revealed. And Ava did not look back immediately. She walked with the same quiet pace she had entered with, her steps soft against the marble floor, each one steady, unhurried, until she reached the door and paused for just a fraction of a second, not waiting, not expecting, just acknowledging the space she was leaving behind. And when she opened it, the hallway